In this lecture, we will discuss types of tissues. Part 1, we will look at epithelial tissue. Similar cells will be arranged to form tissues, and they provide specific functions for the body. The body has 4 major types of tissues. Epithelial tissues will form a protective covering and function in secreting and absorbing certain molecules. Epithelial tissues can be found in the skin, in the gut lining, and even in our lungs. Connective tissue forms the support structures. They hold organs, they help hold organs together and bind structures together. So this will include fat tissue, bone tissue, cartilage tissue. Then we have the muscle tissue. These help produce movement in our body. And then finally we have nervous tissue. They conduct impulses, messages, and help coordinate body's activities. When discussing tissues, to be able to observe them, we have to section them. If we section a tissue across the tissue, that would be considered a cross section. And you'll see the certain cells arranged in this manner. If you want to observe the way the tissues are arranged along the tissue, you will have a longitudinal section. So it's the same tissue that we are looking at. Just by 2 different angles, we will be able to observe different characteristics of the tissue. So now, for this part of the lecture, let's focus and look at epithelial tissue, the different types, their different functions, and even some examples of where these tissues are found. As I mentioned, epithelial tissue helps cover organs, they even cover the body, lines the body cavities, and they also make up glands that will secrete substances. They have a free surface known as the apical surface that is usually open to an open space. It could be open to the air in the case of skin. It could be open to a lumen in the case of the gut. And they also have a basement membrane where they are anchored to the tissue beneath them. They tend to be tightly packed and also form a barrier that substances will not loosely pass through the epithelial tissues. So there are 7 types of epithelial tissues known as simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar, stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, pseudostratified columnar, and transition. Simple squamous epithelial is the most simple form of epithelium. They are very thin cells that are spread that form a very thin lining. You see them along lungs where there needs to be easy exchange. In this case, exchange of gas. You will see this thin layer of cells, just one layer of thin flattened cells are called simple squamous epithelial. And if you take a tissue section, you will see the simple squamous cells lined on the outline has a free apical surface, and the basement membrane will tie it into the other types of tissue. And this is shown as the loose connective tissue. Simple cuboidal epithelium are cuboidal in shape. As you can see, even in this, here you'll see a cross section. Here you will see a longitudinal section. You see this cuboidal shape, and these are usually found in the kidneys. So simple cuboidal cells, as I even showed before, you have this cube shape. They are their height is about the same as their length. And then they will form the lumens as well. Next, we have the simple columnar epithelial. So simple columnar epithelial are these tall cells. As students can see, it's still one line. This is just one layer of cells, but their height is much more larger. They are much more taller than their width, forming these column-like structures. And you see them a lot in the small intestines, in our gut. So simple column epithelial cells, you see them, there is one nucleus for each of these cells. This is another example of these simple columnar cells. One other cell type I wanted to point out are these goblet cells. These are cells that are still part of the simple cube columnar epithelium that are going to secrete substances to the opening. So we talked about how epithelial cells were involved in secretion. So these goblet cells will help secrete. And here I'm defining these as non-ciliated, showing that there is no cilia on the surface of these epithelial cells. Yes, I think I missed this slide before. Here we see some of these cells have this cilia, a covering on top of them, and these cilia are involved in the absorption of nutrients. So that's one of the functions of these ciliated cells. So next we will talk about pseudostratified columnar epithelial. These pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells are going to be still one layer of cell, but as you can see, these nuclei are not all arranged in the same line. So looking at it, we might feel that these are two layers of cells, but each of them are anchored to the basement membrane. So it's pseudo-stratified, not truly stratified. And you will see some of these pseudo-stratified epithelial cells again in the respiratory tract. Previously, we saw that there were simple squamous cells lining the outside of the lungs. Here you see these are part of the respiratory tract inside the lungs. So pseudo-stratified column epithelial cells, we also see these cilia on them. And we see these structures where the nuclei are not in the same plane, not in the same level, but each of these cells are anchored to the basement membrane. Next, we come to the stratified squamous epithelial cells. Now, these are cells that are not just one layer of epithelial cells, there are multiple layers. So, when it's stratified squamous epithelial, you get the stratified levels and you have the squamous, meaning these are just thin cells. So, thin cells stacked on each other. So, we see this right here. And an example shown here is the esophagus, the connection between your mouth and to the rest of your GI tract. Now, when it comes to stratified squamous epithelium, there is also some cells that have some protein known as keratin. Keratin is produced by these epithelial cells, and then you have a layer on top of these epithelial cells. So you have this epithelial cell layer, the stratified squamous epithelial, and a layer of keratin, and you see this on our skin. And if you don't see the keratinized layer, you get stratified squamous epithelium that are non-keratinized, the type of epithelial that we will see in the esophagus, as mentioned before. And here they're showing in blue just one epithelial cell, and we see the different layers all present on this type of cells. Then we also have stratified cuboidal epithelium cells. These are going to be these cuboidal cells that are going to be stratified. and even seen right here, where you'll see distinct two layers of cells that are cuboidal. These are not very common in our body, but they form certain glands. So stratified cuboidal epithelium, you will be able to see distinctly that there are two layers of cells that will be lined in this example here. And here they show just one cuboidal cell, how that is arranged. And then we have the stratified columnar epithelium. Stratified columnar epithelium are going to be epithelial cells, columnar epithelial cells that are now stratified. Again, as you can see, even the topmost layer, we see the height is longer or taller than the width. So if you see in this section, tissue section, we will see one layer of nuclei that are lined first, followed by a second layer of nuclei on the outermost cells. And stratified columnar epithelial line the urethra. Stratified columnar epithelial cells are shown here, where you will see one columnar cell right here. You'll see one right here and one right here, forming at least two layers of cells. Yes. The next tissue type is going to be transitional epithelium cells. So these are epithelial cells that don't really have a certain form in terms of their shape. They can take the form when they are stretched or non-stretched. They will be able to change their shape. So in the case when they are not stretched, we will see them more like cuboidal type of cells. But when they are stretched, we will see them more like squamous type of cells. So these also are in different layers, and these are called transitional epithelial cells. We see these cells mainly in our bladder. So this helps our bladder to extend when we are holding a lot of urine. This will help extend the bladder to hold more urine. And as we can see here, looking at even the surface of the lumen of the bladder, we will see these different cell types, these different layers, these different shapes, and how they can just be stretched to change their shapes. We will continue the rest of the lecture in part 2.